I'm here with Matthias Matthijs, who is a senior fellow for Europe at the Council on Foreign Relations. He's also an associate professor at Johns Hopkins in the School for Advanced International Studies. Good to see you, Matthias.
Good to see you, Diane.
So we are talking about this move toward the far right. We've obviously been seeing it for quite some time, most recently with the elections in the Netherlands with Geert Wilders. Can you tell us more about that, and then we'll move on to this gathering that took place in Florence over the weekend as well. How significant was this election?
Yeah, the Dutch election was a bit of a surprise result because you've kind of had a very stable situation in the Netherlands. 23 years, two prime ministers, one kind of mild-mannered Christian Democrat who was very centrist, called Jan-Peter Balkenende, and then of course Mark Rutte, who was a liberal but progressive but centrist, who had been there for 13 years, 4 cabinets. And so the Party for Freedom, the party of Geert Wilders, had been doing well occasionally, right? In 2010 they did very well, about 15%, and then again 7 years later or so. But nobody really expected him to kind of get to where he did, 23.5%, which in a perfectly proportional system, leads to 37 seats and gives them kind of the initiative to form a government. He never got anywhere close to that. I think what happened is that this was an election fought on migration, on immigration, on asylum seekers, on refugees, and so on, all these things muddled together. And also the outgoing Rutte government, his successor, insisted on fighting the election on this program, had also opened the door to governing with him, but never expecting to have to govern with him as prime minister, right? More having to have his support for a government or something like this, which I think in the last week gave a lot of voters hope that if they voted Wilders, he would actually be in charge, would actually govern. And that kind of saw this surge in just the last week and this kind of shock victory.
What's interesting, especially an American audience is used to the two-party system. And so when you say almost one quarter, obviously this is a coalition government that he will have to form. Let me just, before we get into his platform, note that the party that came second seems to be on the opposite end of the spectrum. I don't know if that's fair to say, but does that basically just point to growing extremism? Because that party got 25 seats. It was very much about climate. It was about rights for migrants and such. Talk a little bit about what it says about the state of Dutch society.
Yeah, so unlike in the United States, where every opinion poll, whether it's Biden versus Trump or it's Republican versus Democrat, they're incredibly close together, right? I mean, there's some states where they're further apart, but in general, the population as a whole is fairly close. In the Netherlands, the left is very small. It's maybe 40 seats of the 150, right? So it gets to maybe 30%, which means 70% is center-right to far-right. So the party of Frans Timmermans, who had united the Greens and the Social Democrats, actually managed to cobble together something like, 20% of the vote. And then there's two more other left-wing parties that are less significant. Then that adds up to that. So everybody was expecting a center-right government, maybe with the support of the far-right, but probably not. In this case, you're going to end up with a much more right-wing government, because that seems to be how the people have voted. The three biggest center-right and right-wing parties all had platforms based on limiting immigration into the Netherlands.
Well, and it's not just immigration, because I know that he's very much been characterized as anti-Islam. Is that fair? I mean, from what I've read, it's banning mosques, banning the Quran. That sounds very problematic, to say the least.
Oh, absolutely. It's unconstitutional in the Netherlands, right? But it's how he got the attention as this kind of firebrand, anti-Islam, anti-migrant. But you're absolutely right? I mean, banning mosques, getting rid of Qurans because they're supposedly incompatible with Dutch society is a non-starter for any other of his coalition partners. And he knows it, right? And Geert Wilders already during the campaign had said things like, well, we don't have to have a referendum on leaving the EU. like he's still campaigning on. We don't have to talk about closing down mosques. These things can be put on the back burner or in the freezer. He said in the Dutch equivalent. So that's one thing. And immediately after the election, a few days later, he was quick to point out, like, listen, we're a party for all Dutch citizens, whether they're Christian, whether they're Muslim, or whether they non-believers. And so that's, I think, the first time he's ever said this, right? But it's also part of, I think, the appeal that he got in the election a few weeks ago was really that even the media had started calling him, instead of Wilders, they call him Milders. Like, he'd become milder in his rhetoric and also vis-a-vis
moving toward the center.
Exactly.